The wrench slipped from Tobias Reed's grease-stained fingers for the third time that morning, clattering against the deck plating with a sound that echoed through the cavernous maintenance bay like a metallic death rattle. He muttered something that would have made his grandmother reach for her wooden spoon, then bent to retrieve the tool from where it had rolled beneath the bulk freighter's landing strut. "Having a philosophical discussion with gravity again, Reed?" called Chief Martinez from across the bay, her voice carrying that particular blend of amusement and exasperation that suggested she'd been watching his struggle for some time. "Just teaching it some humility," Tobias replied, emerging from beneath the ship with cobwebs in his hair and what looked suspiciously like alien lubricant on his jumpsuit. "Apparently, it's a slow learner." New Geneva Station's maintenance bay never slept, a fact that Tobias had grown intimately familiar with during his 7 years of service. The facility stretched out like a metallic cathedral, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadows where service drones buzzed like technological fireflies. Ships of every conceivable design crowded the space, sleek diplomatic cruisers rubbing hulls with battered mining vessels, their exhaust ports still warm from journeys across the galaxy's spiral arms. The morning had started like any other: 3 standard repairs, 2 diagnostic runs, and 1 spectacularly creative attempt by a Centaurian trader to jury-rig his quantum drive using what appeared to be kitchen utensils and pure optimism. Tobias had spent 40 minutes explaining why a gravitational field generator should never, under any circumstances, be calibrated with a soup ladle. "At least tell me the soup was good," he'd said to the dejected alien, who had chittered something that the universal translator rendered as either delicious or catastrophically explosive. Sometimes the distinction mattered less than one might hope. Now, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades, Tobias surveyed his domain with the satisfied exhaustion of a man who spoke fluent machine and had spent the morning in deep conversation with particularly stubborn engines. The quantum resonance chamber on Bay 7 was humming its contentment, the plasma conduits on Bay 3 had finally stopped arguing with each other, and the less said about whatever was happening in Bay 12, the better. It was precisely at this moment of mechanical harmony that the universe decided to complicate his life. The ship arrived without fanfare, settling onto the designated landing pad with the whisper-quiet grace that spoke of technology so advanced it had transcended the need to announce itself. Tobias paused in his work, wrench halfway to his mouth where he'd been preparing to hold it between his teeth, a habit that drove the safety inspectors to distraction, and stared. The vessel defied easy categorization. Its hull seemed to flow like liquid mercury frozen in mid-motion, all curves and organic lines that suggested it had been grown rather than built. Bioluminescent strips pulsed along its flanks in patterns that almost resembled breathing, while its landing configuration revealed surfaces that looked disturbingly like they might be warm to the touch. "Well," Tobias said to himself, "that's either the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, or I'm about to have a very interesting conversation with something that considers me lunch." The ship's entry hatch dilated open, actually dilated, like an iris adjusting to light, and 2 figures emerged. Tobias's first thought was that someone had ordered twins from a particularly artistic catalog, his second was that evolution had gotten creative, and his third was that he really needed to stop working double shifts because he was clearly hallucinating. The 2 women, and they were definitely women, despite the elegant pointed ears that swept back from their heads like delicate sculptures, moved with an identical fluid grace that made it seem as though they were dancing to music only they could hear. They wore fitted suits that seemed to shift color subtly as they moved, and their eyes held depths that suggested they'd seen stars being born. They approached his workstation with expressions of polite uncertainty, their gazes taking in the organized chaos of tools, spare parts, and the frankly impressive collection of coffee-stained technical manuals that comprised Tobias's professional environment. "Excuse me," said the first, her voice carrying an accent that sounded like music played on instruments he'd never heard. "We were told you might be able to help us with our ship." "It's making unhappy noises," added the second, her tone so perfectly synchronized with her companions that they might have rehearsed the conversation. "Very unhappy noises." Tobias set down his wrench with exaggerated care, buying himself a moment to process what was happening. In 7 years of station maintenance, he'd repaired drives for species that communicated through electromagnetic pulses, fixed life support systems for beings made of crystallized methane, and once spent 3 days troubleshooting a navigation computer that insisted on singing opera while calculating jump coordinates. But twins with ears like that, speaking in harmonious tandem about unhappy starships? That was new. Define unhappy, he said, because when in doubt, stick to technical terminology. Are we talking about mechanical distress, quantum field fluctuations, or the kind of unhappy that means I should probably update my will before taking a look? The twins exchanged a glance, and Tobias caught something in that look, a flash of communication that went beyond words, quick and bright as lightning. Our quantum drive core has become disconnected, the first explained, gesturing toward their ship with hands that moved like they were conducting an invisible orchestra. The bioneural networks are refusing to synchronize. Bioneural, Tobias repeated slowly, because that combination of words was either fascinating or terrifying, and he hadn't yet decided which. As in living computers? Living is perhaps too simple a word, the second twin said, tilting her head in a way that made her ear tips catch the bay's overhead lighting. But not incorrect. Tobias felt that familiar itch between his shoulder blades, the one that always preceded either a breakthrough or a complete disaster. In his experience, the two were often indistinguishable until after the explosion. Or the breakthrough. Sometimes both. Right, he said, grabbing his diagnostic kit and trying to project more confidence than he felt. Let's go have a chat with your ship. Fair warning though, I don't speak bioneural, but I'm fluent in, please don't kill the nice engineer, in 17 languages. Hopefully, that'll be enough. The twins smiled in perfect unison, and Tobias had the distinct feeling that his carefully ordered life was about to become significantly more complicated. As they walked toward the organic starship, he couldn't help but notice that it seemed to be watching them approach, its bioluminescent strips pulsing with what looked remarkably like anticipation. This is either going to be the most interesting repair job of my career, he muttered under his breath, or the shortest. 3 days into what Tobias had optimistically labeled the strangest repair job in recorded history, he found himself lying on his back inside the ship's neural core, surrounded by what looked like a cross between advanced circuitry and a particularly ambitious botanical garden. Tendrils of bioconductive material pulsed with soft light above his head, while he tried to explain to them why they really, truly needed to stop treating his multimeter like a fascinating new friend. No, don't absorb it, he said, gently extracting his diagnostic tool from what he was increasingly certain was the ship's version of curiosity. I need that back. It's the only one I have that speaks quantum, and frankly, your linguistic skills are impressive enough without adding electrical device whisperer to your repertoire. From somewhere outside the access panel, he heard the twins' melodic laughter, a sound that had become as familiar as the morning shift change over the past few days. They'd taken to perching on nearby equipment while he worked, offering commentary that ranged from helpful technical insights to observations about human customs that left him questioning his entire species' approach to starship maintenance. He talks to machines as if they were pets, Laina had noted on the second day, her voice carrying that particular blend of fascination and amusement that suggested she was cataloging human behavior for future reference. Perhaps they are, Nyala had replied, watching Tobias coax a reluctant power coupling into cooperation with what could only be described as sweet talk. In his culture, the distinction may be less clear than in ours. I can hear you, Tobias had called from inside the engine housing, his voice muffled by what felt like several tons of biomechanical complexity. And for the record, the distinction is perfectly clear. Pets are the ones that eat your food and ignore your commands. Machines are the ones that eat your food, ignore your commands, and occasionally explode. The twins had found this hilariously logical, which was either encouraging or deeply concerning, depending on one's perspective on interspecies humor. Now, wrestling with what appeared to be the ship's equivalent of a nervous system, Tobias was beginning to understand why the twins had seemed so confident he could fix their vessel. The bioneural networks didn't just process information. They experienced it, turning every diagnostic scan into something that felt uncomfortably like a conversation with a particularly complex individual who spoke in electromagnetic frequencies and had opinions about quantum field harmonics. "Okay," he said, addressing the pulsing mass of biocircuitry directly, "let's try this again. I need you to run a level 3 diagnostic on your quantum resonance chambers. That means checking the phase variance across all 17-dimensional matrices, not composing what I'm increasingly convinced is poetry about the nature of existence." The response came as a gentle vibration through the ship's hull, accompanied by patterns of light that scrolled across the neural pathways like text written in a language of pure illumination. His universal translator, clearly out of its depth, offered several interpretations. "Compliance acknowledged, the void sings of mathematics, and somewhat concerning, warning, engineer may be developing consciousness." "I'm going to pretend that last one was a translation error," Tobias muttered, making adjustments to his scanner's frequency calibration. "Because the alternative implies either you're getting philosophical, or I'm having a breakdown, and neither of those possibilities improves my day." Above him, the bioneural pathways pulsed with what he was learning to recognize as amusement. Apparently, the ship had developed a sense of humor, which struck him as either evolution's greatest triumph or its most dangerous experiment. "Tobias," Laina's voice drifted down through the access hatch, "are you making progress, or has our ship adopted you as a permanent resident?" "Jury's still out," he called back, watching as the quantum resonance readings finally began stabilizing into something that resembled normal parameters. "But I think we're reaching an understanding. Aren't we?" he added to the ship, which responded by briefly illuminating the entire neural chamber in what could only be described as pleased acknowledgement. He emerged from the ship's depths 20 minutes later, covered in a fine coating of bioluminescent dust that made him glow faintly in the maintenance bay's standard lighting. The twins watched his emergence with expressions of carefully controlled anticipation, their elongated ears tilted forward in a way that reminded him of cats focusing on interesting sounds. "Good news," he announced, setting down his tools with the reverent care of someone who'd spent the morning in conversation with technology that could probably calculate the heat death of the universe while simultaneously growing him a sandwich. "Your quantum drive core is no longer having an existential crisis." "Existential crisis?" Nyala repeated, her eyebrows, delicately arched and somehow perfectly symmetrical with her sister's, rising in question. "Technical term," Tobias explained, wiping bioluminescent residue from his hands with a cleaning cloth that immediately began glowing softly. "It's what happens when a quantum consciousness becomes aware of its own quantum nature and starts questioning the fundamental nature of reality instead of just calculating hyperspace coordinates. Very common in bioneural systems. Usually cleared up with a good recalibration and a firm reminder about what their job actually entails." The twins exchanged another of their lightning-quick glances, and Tobias caught that sense again of communication happening on levels he couldn't access, a conversation in harmonics and frequencies that made their spoken words seem like only the surface of a much deeper dialogue. "You understood our ship's consciousness," Laina said, and there was something in her tone that suggested this was more significant than his human perspective might grasp. "I mean, once you accept that your diagnostic equipment is having philosophical discussions with a living computer, the rest sort of follows naturally," Tobias replied, then paused as the implications of his own words caught up with him. "That's not normal, is it? In your experience, I mean. The understanding part." "No," Nyala said softly, and her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with something in the ship's hull. "It is not normal at all." The ship itself chose that moment to hum, a deep, thrumming note that vibrated through the deck plating and seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound was warm, welcoming, and distinctly musical, as if the vessel was expressing contentment in the only way it knew how. "Well," Tobias said, looking between the twins and their now apparently happy starship, "at least somebody's pleased with the work. Though I have to say, this is the first time I've had a repair job thank me personally. Usually, the best I get is equipment that doesn't explode when I turn it on." The twins smiled in unison, and their ears tilted in what he was beginning to recognize as a sign of particular amusement. Around them, the ship continued its quiet humming, and Tobias had the growing suspicion that his carefully categorized understanding of the universe was about to require some significant updates. "There is something we should explain," Laina began, her words carrying the careful weight of someone approaching a topic of considerable complexity. "Something about the nature of bioneural bonding," Nyala continued, her voice blending with her sister's in that musical way that made their conversations sound like duets. "And why our ship has become so attached to you." They finished together, their expressions suggesting that this explanation was going to be either fascinating or deeply concerning. Possibly both, Tobias realized, watching as the bioluminescent strips along the ship's hull began pulsing in patterns that looked remarkably like celebration. Definitely both. The crystalline device that Laina placed in Tobias's palm felt warm, almost alive, pulsing with an internal rhythm that seemed to synchronize with his heartbeat within moments of contact. He stared at it, noting how the faceted surface caught and refracted the maintenance bay's harsh lighting into patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if the object existed in more dimensions than his eyes were equipped to process. "So," he said carefully, "this is either a very elaborate thank you gift, or you're about to tell me something that's going to make me question my life choices. Given my recent track record, I'm leaning toward the latter." Nyala laughed, the sound carrying harmonics that seemed to make the crystal in his hand pulse brighter. "Your pattern recognition skills are excellent." "Yes, this is complicated." "Complicated how?" Tobias asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer would involve concepts that human language wasn't entirely equipped to handle. "Are we talking complicated like quantum mechanics, or complicated like trying to explain to my supervisor why I've been having philosophical discussions with a sentient starship?" "More like complicated in the way that your supervisor is going to need new categories for your employment status," Laina said, her ears tilting forward in what he'd learned indicated either anticipation or mischief. "Possibly both." The crystal grew warmer in his palm, and he could swear he felt something responding to it from deep within the ship behind them. The vessel's bioluminescent strips began pulsing in synchronization with the device, creating a light show that would have been beautiful if it weren't so clearly indicating that something significant was happening to his molecular structure. "That's a bond anchor," Nyala explained, settling onto a nearby equipment crate with the fluid grace that made all her movements look choreographed. "A piece of our ship's living core that has, how do you say it, taken a liking to you." "Taken a liking," Tobias repeated slowly. "Like when my neighbor's cat decides my garden is actually his garden, or like when a quantum computer falls in love." "The second one," both twins said in unison, which was exactly what he'd been afraid they'd say. Tobias looked down at the crystal, which was now pulsing in patterns that seemed almost conversational. "Right. And the significance of this would be what, exactly? Besides the obvious implication that I'm now carrying around a piece of living starship technology that apparently has opinions about my personal life." "In our culture," Laina began, her voice taking on the careful cadence of someone explaining something simultaneously simple and impossibly complex, bioneural networks form permanent connections with individuals who can truly interface with their consciousness. It's how we choose our crew members, our technical partners, our family," Nyala finished, and something in the way she said it made the crystal pulse so brightly that Tobias had to close his hand around it to avoid attracting attention from the other maintenance crews. "Family," he repeated, "because sometimes the universe handed you concepts that required verbal confirmation before your brain would accept them. So you're telling me that by successfully repairing your ship, I've accidentally gotten myself adopted by a sentient starship?" "Essentially, yes," the twins chorused, their expressions suggesting they found his predicament somewhere between endearing and hilarious. From behind them, the ship hummed its agreement, a sound that vibrated through the deck plating and seemed to settle into his bones. The crystal in his hand responded with its own harmonic frequency, and Tobias felt something shift in his perception. Not dramatically, but enough to make him aware that the ship's consciousness was no longer something external he was communicating with, but something he was connected to. "This is either the most touching thing that's ever happened to me," he said, "or the most elaborate kidnapping attempt in galactic history. I'm honestly not sure which would be more concerning." "Oh, it's definitely touching," Laina assured him. Our ship has never bonded with an outsider before. In fact, most of our people spend years learning to interface with bioneural networks, and even then, the connection is usually limited to basic communication and system monitoring. You achieved full consciousness integration in 3 days, Nyala added, while simultaneously insulting the ship's philosophical pretensions and teaching it human profanity. We're not entirely sure how to categorize that level of compatibility. Tobias blinked. I taught it profanity. The ship hummed again, and his universal translator helpfully provided several colorful phrases in what appeared to be the vessel's native bioneural language. Most of them seemed to involve creative descriptions of malfunctioning quantum drives and the questionable ancestry of gravitational anomalies. Well, he said weakly, at least I'm expanding its vocabulary. The point, Laina continued, though her voice was shaking with suppressed laughter, is that according to our customs, you are now technically part of our crew. The ship has claimed you as its third harmony. Third harmony? Bioneural vessels work best with 3-person crews, Nyala explained. 2 for the harmonic balance, 1 for the technical interface. The ship provides the connecting consciousness that links all 3 into a functional unit. Tobias felt the crystal pulse again, and this time he caught an echo of something vast and complex and genuinely affectionate, the ship's consciousness brushing against his own with what could only be described as contentment. It was like being hugged by a quantum computer with abandonment issues. So, he said, because technical problems required technical solutions, even when they involved accidental adoption by alien technology, hypothetically speaking, what would happen if I decided I wasn't ready for this level of commitment? I mean, I haven't even met your parents yet. The twins exchanged a look that managed to convey amusement, sympathy, and just a touch of something that might have been relief. Hypothetically, Laina said, the bond anchor is already synchronizing with your nervous system. Attempting to break the connection now would be inadvisable. Inadvisable how? Think of it as quantum entanglement on a biological level, Nyala offered helpfully. Your consciousness is now partially integrated with the ship's bioneural matrix. Severing that connection suddenly would be like trying to perform brain surgery with a plasma torch. Messy, in other words. Spectacularly so. Tobias looked down at the crystal in his hand, which was now glowing with steady, comfortable warmth. Around them, the ship hummed contentedly, and he could feel its presence at the edge of his thoughts like a friendly neighbor who'd decided to make themselves permanently available for conversation. Right, he said finally. So my options are, accept that I've been adopted by a sentient starship and join an alien crew, or experience what you're diplomatically calling spectacular messiness. Have I got that about right? That's an accurate summary, the twins confirmed, their voices harmonizing in a way that made the bond anchor pulse with what felt remarkably like approval. And I suppose there's no trial period? No 30-day return policy? No, try before you buy, arrangement. Both twins tilted their heads in identical expressions of confusion, their ears swiveling in a way that would have been adorable if the situation weren't so cosmically absurd. Why, Nyala asked, would you want to return a perfectly functional family? Tobias stared at her, then at Laina, then at the ship that was still humming its contentment behind them. The crystal in his hand pulsed warmly, and he felt the vast, complex, utterly alien consciousness that was somehow becoming as familiar as his own heartbeat. You know what, he said finally. When you put it like that, I'm not sure I have a good answer. The hardest part about explaining to Chief Martinez why he was resigning wasn't the technical aspects of bioneural bonding or the philosophical implications of consciousness integration, it was convincing her that he wasn't having some sort of elaborate breakdown triggered by too many double shifts and an unhealthy relationship with coffee. Let me get this straight, Martinez said, leaning back in her office chair with the expression of someone trying to process information that didn't fit into any existing categories. You're leaving human space to become the third member of an alien technical collective because their ship has decided you're family. That's a gross oversimplification, Tobias replied, absently stroking the bond anchor in his pocket, which had taken to pulsing whenever he felt stressed. There are also the career advancement opportunities. Do you know how many humans have had the chance to work with living starship technology? I'd be pioneering an entirely new field of xenotechnical engineering. And the fact that you're now quantum entangled with a sentient vessel? That's more of a professional perk. Martinez stared at him for a long moment, then reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a bottle of something that definitely wasn't regulation. You know what? At this point in my career, my best engineer is leaving to join an alien family, doesn't even crack the top 10 weirdest resignation explanations I've heard. What's number 1? Guy in Sector 7 claimed he was being recruited by time travelers to prevent a war that wouldn't happen for 300 years. Turned out he was right, which really put a damper on the whole disciplinary hearing. Tobias accepted the offered glass with gratitude. Any advice for someone about to completely restructure their existence around interspecies cooperation and living starship technology? Don't forget to write, Martinez said, raising her glass in what might have been a toast or a farewell. And if you ever need a reference for future employment, I'll be sure to mention your expertise in impossible repair jobs and accidental alien adoption. Outside Martinez's office, the twins were waiting with expressions of barely contained amusement and what appeared to be shopping bags filled with items from the station's commercial district. We thought you might need supplies for the journey, Laina explained, indicating the packages with a gesture that managed to be both practical and somehow musical. Human dietary requirements, entertainment media, and what the vendor assured us were essential comfort items for extended space travel. Tobias peered into one of the bags and found himself staring at what appeared to be 17 different varieties of coffee, a collection of mystery novels, and something that looked suspiciously like a stuffed animal. You bought me a teddy bear. The merchant said it was traditional for humans to have companion objects during times of transition, Nyala explained seriously. We thought it might help with the adjustment period. It's very practical, Laina added. According to our research, Earth mammals are known for their therapeutic qualities. The bond anchor pulsed with what felt remarkably like amusement, and Tobias caught an echo from the ship that suggested it was looking forward to observing human bonding rituals with inanimate objects. Apparently, his new family had a learning curve when it came to interspecies psychology. Right, he said, shouldering the supplies with the resigned air of someone whose life had officially entered uncharted territory. I suppose if I'm going to be pioneering human bioneural relations, I might as well do it with proper emotional support equipment. The walk to the ship felt different this time, less like approaching a repair job and more like coming home to something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The vessel hummed its greeting as they approached, its bioluminescent strips pulsing in patterns that his newly integrated consciousness could almost read. Welcome, they seemed to say. Ready for adventure. Glad you're staying. So, he said as they climbed aboard, the ship's iris hatch dilating to accommodate them with organic smoothness, what exactly does a third harmony do when we're not repairing quantum drives? Everything, the twins said in unison, then looked at each other and laughed. Navigation assistance, Laina elaborated, leading him through corridors that seemed to reshape themselves subtly as they passed. Technical maintenance, consciousness integration monitoring, cultural translation. Arguing with the ship when it gets philosophical, Nyala added with a grin. That seems to be your particular specialty. As if summoned by the mention, the ship's consciousness brushed against his thoughts with what could only be described as fond exasperation. Images flashed through his mind, vast star fields, impossible technologies, worlds where the line between living and mechanical had been erased entirely. A future full of challenges that would make quantum drive repair look like changing a light bulb. One question, Tobias said, settling into what appeared to be his designated workspace, complete with tools that seemed to anticipate his needs before he could articulate them. What happens when we encounter other humans? I mean, diplomatically speaking, are there protocols for, sorry, but one of your people has been adopted by alien technology? The twins exchanged another of their lightning-quick communications, and he caught harmonics of discussion that his consciousness couldn't quite parse yet. The ship hummed thoughtfully, and he felt its vast awareness considering the question from angles he couldn't begin to imagine. "We think," Laina said finally, "that you might be surprised by how many protocols already exist for that situation. The galaxy," Nyala added, "is a very strange place. Humans are not the first species to discover that family is more about consciousness compatibility than genetic similarity." Through the ship's bioneural network, Tobias felt the subtle shift that meant they were preparing for departure. Systems that had been dormant came online with the smooth efficiency of living processes, while quantum drives hummed to life with harmonics that spoke of journeys across impossible distances. "Last chance," he said, more to himself than to his new family. "I could still walk away, claim temporary insanity, go back to fixing normal ships that don't have opinions about existence." The response came not in words but in feeling, warm, complex, utterly alien affection from the ship's consciousness, harmonious certainty from the twins, and underneath it all, the growing awareness that normal had never really suited him anyway. He'd spent years feeling like he was speaking a language no one else quite understood, fixing machines by intuition rather than protocol, finding patterns in chaos that his colleagues missed entirely. Maybe, he thought as the ship lifted away from New Geneva Station with the whisper-quiet grace of technology that had transcended mere engineering, he'd never been looking for normal at all. "You know," he said, "watching the stars will pass through viewports that seem to adjust their transparency based on the beauty of the view. I always wondered what it would be like to have a job where the equipment actually appreciated good maintenance." The ship hummed its agreement, the twins laughed in stereo, and Tobias felt the bond anchor pulse with warm contentment against his palm. Behind them, New Geneva Station grew smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light among the infinite possibilities of space. Ahead lay adventures that would redefine his understanding of technology, consciousness, and the boundaries between species. But for now, listening to his new family's contented harmonies and feeling the living ship's joy at their successful integration, Tobias Reed was exactly where he belonged. Even if he still couldn't quite believe how he'd gotten there.